We're talking to Charlie Kirk on socialism, Generation Disabled enters the universities, and National Geographic using propaganda to scare everyone for no good reason, next on The Dr. Duke Show. Hey you, I'm Dr. Duke, and thank you very much for joining us. Coming up later in the show, we'll be sitting down to talk socialism and Democrats with our friend Charlie Kirk. But first, as always, I'm joined by Katie Petrick of the Healthy Republic. Katie, for the top stories, what do you got for us today?
We're going to kick off with some socialism, and it all comes in the way of the one and only Bernie Sanders. We've talked on this show a couple times questioning if Bernie Sanders has ever put forth any meaningful legislation. While he's trying in his own little way, he actually came out with a piece of legislation where he is proposing basically Medicare for all. And we had a libertarian-leaning Mercatus Center, which is at the George Mason University. They did an analysis of this piece of legislation, and they found that this national health insurance system will come at a price tag leading to a $32.6 trillion increase in federal spending over a 10-year period. Now, Bernie Sanders' protege, the one and only Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is all in favor of this. She went on Trevor Noah and she talked about, well, actually the national expenditures on health care could decrease by $2 trillion by 2031 if we follow, Sanders' plan, and if all we have to do is just raise taxes a little on just a couple other things.
Well, first of all, if a liberal think tank values the Medicare takeover by the federal government, the expansion of it, to $32 trillion, it's probably going to cost $64 trillion, number one. Number two, Alexandria Cortez sat down with Trevor Noah. There's a brain trust, an idiot and a racist. This is the same Trevor Noah, right? Who basically insulted all Aboriginal women as being below his sexual standards, right? So, okay, you got the racist and you got an idiot sitting down to talk about economics. The thing that gets me most about this, and I think the real takeaway for us, is the progressive left has decided that they can't win the debate on health care. Obamacare is an unmitigated disaster. And single payer, which is what they really wanted when they put Obamacare in, is not a big seller. People recognize that single payer is really code for absolute government control of health care, very little independence, very little freedom, very little ability to choose your own health care, high premiums, shortages, rationing. And so the brain trust of Sanders and Cortez have come up with a novel plan. Let's just take an existing federal program that probably really shouldn't have existed in the first place. Let's take an existing federal program, Medicare, and let's transform it into single-payer health care without telling anybody. Now, I believe categorically that despite the fact that many Americans are economically illiterate, we're a functionally illiterate country when it comes to economics. However, people do recognize, on the other hand, a boondoggle when they see it. They snuck the Affordable Care Act. They snuck Obamacare in by calling it the Affordable Care Act. Anybody alive today who remembers that and who now recognizes that there's nothing affordable about the Affordable Care Act are going to have a much harder time accepting the idea that Medicare is going to become single-payer health care and keep its name Medicare. People are too smart for that. And with the economy booming the way it is, I actually think that this is a continually losing cause for the Democrats. Let them keep pushing it.
Yeah, and speaking of the economy, the U.S. GDP growth hit 4.1% in the second quarter. Basically, the Commerce Department came out and said, hey, this is the first time in 4 years that our economic growth broke that kind of 4% mark, that little barrier. And, economists are saying this, not Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, even though she claims, economics major and all. But they're saying the major reason is because of the tax cuts that Trump pushed for, and we have a healthy job market out there. So we're past the 4% mark. Now we can't get too excited because overall 2018 is still looking to be about a 2.8% growth. But hey, take it and be happy when you can get it.
Yeah, if you put Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Cortez in a room with 50 of the world's top economists, you'd have 50 great economists and those two. They would add nothing to the conversation. They have no idea what they're talking about. And the fact that the Democrat Party actually sees them as legitimate players when it comes to economics shows you why the country is primarily still a conservative country, why Republicans, as feckless as they are, still control the vast majority of governorships and of state legislatures. And I do think that the American people understand, if they don't understand economics broadly, what they do understand is what's going on in their local communities. They understand how much money they get from their paychecks every week. They understand how they're able to pay for vacations and their kids' schooling, extracurricular activities for their kids after school. Moms and dads realize that they're better off now, that they're much better off than they were under Obama, and that they're actually as well as they've been perhaps in their memory. And as long as that continues, and I think it will continue, we're going to see these. Seems interesting. It's almost a maxim of American politics. When conservatives take power, or at least relatively conservative people take power, economically conservative people take power, and then improve the status of the country, bring greater wealth to all, the Democrats, rather than getting on board with the programs and trying to hijack those programs and call them their own, they immediately go full stupid left, right? They go hard on left. Right, and that's, well, never mind. They go hard on left, right? There's a joke there that I won't make. They do it because they are more wedded to their ideology than they are to the reality of what makes people happy and what makes people productive. The Democrat Party, and this should let you, if you ever need a reminder of this, think of this, we've been talking about the last 5 minutes. The Democrat Party is not interested in your prosperity, America. It's not interested in your happiness and your health. It's interested in their own ideology, failed ideology, progressive Marxist socialist ideology. They would rather have you serfs and slaves under their control than to be free people, even if you were free to vote for them, free people who have money to pay taxes and to improve the lives of other people. That's the reality on the ground, and that's the reality in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and that reality is showing through in one of the most lefty cities that we have in the nation, San Francisco. There's a new proposal in San Francisco that is going to ban any employers who create new buildings to not allow their employees to have free cafeteria lunches. Basically, we have two supervisors, Asha Safai and Aaron Peskin, who are pushing a bill that would prohibit any new office buildings to allow employees there to eat lunch on the company dime. Instead, these employees would have to go out and basically be in the community. Now, this would have to amend the San Francisco Planning Code, and it would be heard in committee coming up in September. So we're going to see what happens with this. But the advocates are saying that banning these free workplace lunches would help support the small businesses of San Francisco.
Yeah, and this is really staggering when you think about it. Shows the arrogance of what we were just saying. You have a situation here where the feckless government, city government of San Francisco, which allows untrammeled illegal immigration, which allows illegal immigrant rapists and murderers to walk the streets free of any persecution or arrest. This is a city that has fountains of urine, rivers of urine and fountains of feces all over the city government, all over the steps, all over the sidewalks. And what they're saying now is they have so mismanaged the huge taxes they collect, the disgustingly large taxes they collect from local individuals and businesses, that they can no longer afford it all. So what they're going to do is they're going to force private companies to no longer be allowed to serve food, lunch, breakfast, lunch, and dinner to their employees. Going to force these employees out into the fecal streets, right? To step over drunken hippies, to step over naked dudes pooping in boxes, to try to avoid HIV-laced syringes that line the streets, to go into a local restaurant where they're not allowed to order a damn straw to drink their iced tea. This is a perfect example. This is the illustration of what happens when you trust progressive government over individual businesses. Individual businesses are doing so well that they can afford to take care of their workers. You know, the people who show up for work every day and pay the taxes, the people who pay parking taxes and street toll taxes to make San Francisco function, those people are getting a free lunch from the employers who take their hard-earned work and pay them. What does the city of San Francisco want to do? They want to take even more money from those people, prohibit those businesses from feeding their own employees, hardworking employees, and lavish that money on street urine and free syringes for all, and illegal immigrant hoedowns. This is what they want to do.
Speaking of hoedowns, we're going to go to Texas then. We have a lot of political correctness run amok. So the city of Austin in Texas was founded by a man named Stephen F. Austin. And now he's known as the father of Texas, but now Austin is actually considering renaming the city because of his ties to slavery. And so they want to rid the city of his name. And the council's already basically renamed Robert E. Lee Road and Jeff Davis Avenue because, of course, slavery. And they're considering getting rid of Dixie Drive, Confederate Avenue, Plantation Road, and a bunch of monuments and all that other thing happening. The chief equity officer, Brian Oakes, said that, quote, nearly all monuments to the Confederacy and its leaders were erected without a true democratic process.
Yeah, right. The thing about this is that everybody knows Austin. Everybody knows Austin as the San Francisco of Texas. It's almost kind of amusing to let liberals rename. I mean, by that argument, let's rename San Francisco.
Absolutely.
Right? San Francisco is named for a saint, Saint Francis, right? And so rename it. I mean, all the Catholic Church's ties to slavery and to money hoarding and to the mistreatment of gays and women and lesbians, all of it. How can you, San Francisco, call yourself a progressive state when you are named after a Roman Catholic saint? Let's get all these progressive countries and cities within red states like Texas, let's get them to rename themselves. Let's get them to rename themselves so nobody now associates those stupid names. Nobody is, here's the reality, nobody associates, outside of Texas, nobody associates Austin with Stephen F. Austin. We're so historically illiterate, this country. Nobody associates Austin with, what do they associate Austin with? Radical, left-wing, stupid hippie, San Francisco hippie politics in the middle of a red state. By all means, rename it something else. Go ahead. Why don't you name it Guevara, right? Che Guevara, and rename the Texas Longhorns, because Longhorns is clearly a sexist concept, right? It's not female cows. The Longhorns are always males, right? Yep. So steers. So let's rename the university Che Guevara University, centered in the capital, in one of the great cities of Texas, Che Guevara, Texas, because then you're going to have an interesting problem. Che Guevara was a murderer of homosexuals. Che Guevara set up the killing fields of Castro. You keep naming your cities after progressive enlightened leaders, and then we'll have this conversation 5 minutes from now about how you have to rename it again.
Well, we're going to go over to New York, and we have a Eugene Lang College, which I've never heard of until this point. Well, they're going to offer a course this fall in case you're looking to go back to school. They're going to offer a course this fall called Queer Ecologies, and the whole point of the course is to counter this heterosexist explanation of animals and nature. It's a 4-credit class offered by the Culture and Media Department. We're not quite sure why that department's offering this, but it's going to be taught by Heather Davis, and she explained that the course takes aim at how institutions like media outlets and schools often perpetuate myths about sex, gender, and the environment. She says students will reimagine evolutionary processes, ecological interactions, and environmental politics in light of queer theory by drawing from research in fields such as feminist science studies and environmental justice.
Yeah, we've been warning you about this for a long time now. Do you see what's happening? This is a humanities course. In other words, I hate to say it as a humanities professor myself, it's a largely worthless course given how it's being taught. This is a course of humanities professors who have no scientific background, who don't know the first thing about the environment, who have never studied biology at a serious level. These are social justice warrior humanities professors. These are women's studies professors. These are social justice professors. And what they're doing is they are subtly appropriating scientific sounding discourse. The title of the course is not a bunch of liberal arts professors talking about science. No. They're calling the course Queer Ecologies. Right? Think about that. Feminist biology. Biology is biology. It does not change based on your politics. Ecology is ecology. The study of the environment is a scientific study regardless of who you voted for president. But what the university is doing, and we're seeing this all across the country now, is they are appropriating science-y sounding language to make it seem like what they're doing carries as much weight as what the scientists are doing, and it doesn't. In fact, in order to be a queer ecologist, you have to ignore actual ecology. The fact is that biology tells us there is male and female. Biology has discovered nothing else yet. By a careful study of all living creatures, there is the male and the female. And so in order to get around that unfortunate problem for transgender radicals, for environmentalist radicals, you have to now make the argument that heterosexuality is the male and the female going together is not normal. It's actually abnormal. Now, of course, to do that scientifically would be impossible. So what do? You create programs like this taught by unqualified humanities professors who are appropriating the language of science. I'm surprised these people aren't walking around in lab coats, right? I'm a women's studies professor. The lab coat and a stethoscope, right? Or some sociology professor tooling around with a microscope in hand to make them seem like they're legitimate science. Don't let me hear from you again, academic left, that you are the party of science. You are the party that recognizes that science matters to people much more so than women's studies does. And so what you're going to do is pretend that all your women's studies professors are scientists, to take them seriously, to change the very nature of how we understand biology and reality.
And we're going to keep with the universities, and we have a professor who is calling on art teachers to reject the geometry of whiteness. So at the University of North Texas, an art education professor named Tyson E. Lewis, he teaches classes on critical pedagogy and aesthetic theory. You know, that's worth something. He contributed a chapter on art education and whiteness at Style in a new guide aimed for other educators to read, and that's called the Palgrave Handbook of Race and Arts in Education. He says that Because whiteness and maleness are geometric styles, aesthetic questions are intrinsically political, and political questions are inherently aesthetic. Art education needs to draw upon critical whiteness studies to further its social justice agenda, while at the same time recognizing the resources that art education brings to questions of whiteness.
Because there is racism in the world, black is white and white is black, up and down is up. Because there has been a history of aesthetic racism throughout our cultural milieu, therefore truth is false and false is true. Therefore, you see how stupid this is. You think, mom and dad, you're sending your kids to college to be art majors. Well, first of all, if you're sending your kids to school to be art majors, you better make sure that they have a backup plan, right? Or you have a really good trust fund for them established when they graduate. But you think you're sending your kids to college to study art, right? Drawing and painting and sculpture and aesthetic appreciation. No, you're sending them to study art so they can be social justice warriors. And so go back to the previous story. This is, once again, university professors who can do nothing else but radical social justice politics infiltrating yet another area. We saw in the previous segment how science is being co-opted by progressive left-wing social justice warriors in order to make the world seem something that it's not. Now we're doing it with art, too. The purpose of art is not beauty, it's not truth, it's not expression, it's not function or form. The purpose of art now is to reify social justice notions about race. And they even, notice what they do. This professor even dragged the word geometry, right?
Ooh,
into his, as if somehow we're going to be looking at proportion, we're going to be looking at balance and perspective, you know, how wonderfully mathematical much high-level art is. Takes a lot of mathematics to be a great painter or sculptor. That's not the math we're interested in. We're interested in the geometry of whiteness and masculinity. Ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't already figured it out, and we've said it, we'll say it again for the second consecutive segment here. Universities are places of propaganda, masquerading as education, and they're charging you, mom and dad, hundreds of thousands of dollars to send your kids to these institutions of propaganda, where they learn nothing but the same social justice lesson again and again and again, where genuine science and genuine humanistic knowledge is being undercut for their political vanity. Do your kids really need that?
So we're going to go from this guy who's an art educator. So he's teaching the next generation of art teachers so that those art teachers can then go join their teachers unions, who just announced that they outright said they're planning to become more political, not less political. So we have the National Education Association, the NEA, and the American Federation of Teachers, the AFT. They both held their national conferences or conventions in July. And so I'm just going to give you a couple things that basically were covered at both of them, and you tell me how crazy they are. So we have the NEA, who kicked it off with David Hogg, your best friend. He joined the NEA president on stage saying, "There's nothing more powerful in America than a pissed off teacher." Well, that's lovely. They gave the Human and Civil Rights Award to Michelle Obama and Colin Kaepernick for, quote, demonstrating remarkable courage and conviction to stand up for racial and social justice. They also adopted 122 new business items. Some of those included they're going to support Black Lives Matter, and they're going to follow the BLM movement's demand that ethnic studies be taught in pre-K to 12 schools. They supported a strategy postponing confirmation of the Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh until after the midterm election. They encouraged teachers to assign readings that, quote, describe and deconstruct the systemic proliferation of a white supremacy culture and its constituent elements of white privilege and institutional racism. And there's a promise that they're going to respond in support of and in solidarity with immigrant families who are separated, incarcerated, or refuse their legal right to request asylum due to the heartless, racist, and discriminatory zero-tolerance policies of the Trump administration.
Yeah, so you just ticked off about a dozen things.
That's just the NEAs,
right,
too.
And almost none of them had anything to do with education.
Absolutely.
They had to do with politics and business and Supreme Court nominees and immigrants and Daniel Hogg, who has nothing to do with education. I'm sorry, David Hogg, who has nothing to do with education. Over and over again, the entire platform of the NEA has nothing to do with your kids' education. And so are you surprised that they're doubling down on politics? They gave up teaching your kids years ago. They gave up providing your kids a serious mathematical or scientific or literacy education. They're not interested in helping your kids become the best they can be, to provide for their own families, to become entrepreneurs or college graduates or doctors or lawyers. They're not interested in that. The primary purpose of your kids' government schools, according to the teachers' unions, is their political vanity, is changing the world in the image of people like Michelle Obama and Colin Kaepernick. Just like your kids, many of your kids do not need a university education and certainly don't need to major in queer science or ecology or twisted geometrical racist art. your kids don't need to be in the public schools. There's no better way. They're looking at you, if what they consider if what David Hogg considers the most important kind of a teacher is a pissed off teacher, then that pissed off teacher isn't teaching your kids. If that's the criterion, we want a politically pissed off teacher, that's the summa of what we want in terms of our educational policy, it just shows you that education is not what they're after. So get your kids out now. If you want to provide your kids with an education that cares about its country, with an education that is going to provide them for the skills they need in life, for an education that's going to make them humanistic and holistic, that's going to allow them to pick up other disciplines and subjects and understand them, to have a passing knowledge of our cultural history, can't send your kids to liberal arts programs and universities, and you certainly can't send your kids to public schools.
And that's why we have a bunch of students who now, we have about 1 in 5 incoming college freshmen who are saying that they're disabled. It's not surprising that they're saying this. We do have this upcoming year. It's going to be interesting. It's the first class of Gen Z, or the iGen. They haven't really officially named themselves because they can identify however they want. But they're claiming disability. At Pomona University, 22% of the incoming freshmen are saying they have some sort of a disability. At Stanford, it's 14%. Vassar College in New York, it's 18%. And Jan Collins-Eaglin, the Claremont Consortium, that's Pomona's in, she's the Associate Dean of Students for Personal Success and Wellness. She says that anxiety and stress are likely behind the increase in the number of disabled students. Now, it's interesting because this isn't actually, this amount is I guess, being put out there, but it's not new, because in 2012, they found that tons of students across the nation were claiming they had ADHD, and so it made it so when they took their SATs, they had all the time they wanted, they had all these accommodations, and that helped them get into universities like Harvard and Yale and all the Ivy Leagues.
Right, so this is two things. One, these kids are disabled, and it's much higher than 20%, and the disability is lack of a genuine education. They are not educated to prepare, they're not prepared to do college work at a college level. There's nothing, you just saw what the unions are pushing. There's nothing in the program of Progressive Teachers Union that's going to prepare kids for actual academic study. And so what happens? They are, in one sense, they are meaningfully disabled in that we have disabled their ability to perform where they should be when they enter college. Number one. Number two, these kids are also smart enough to have figured out that if they label themselves disabled, if they claim disability, then all the standard rules for college kids go away. Time limits on exams, due dates and deadlines in college classrooms, requiring kids to take remedial courses but not get credit for them before they take their real courses, the morphing, the way majors are morphing, right? Morphing away from serious study in the STEM careers to things like geometry and art and all the goofy things we've talked about in the show so far. So there is a real disability here, and it's an educational disability. And the people who foisted this disability on these kids are teachers and progressive unions and liberals. And so now that you've created a generation of disabled college kids, you're going to have to treat them. And how do you treat them? Not by expecting more for them or trying to heal them or, heaven forbid, trying to educate that disability away. You're going to tailor your universities to their disabilities. You're not going to hold them responsible. You're not going to ask very much for them. You're going to ask them to pay less for what they're getting. You're going to give them more perks. You're going to give them more free time. You're going to give them more lavish accommodations in their dorms and in their workout facilities on campus. But you're not going to address the root of their disability. In ignorance. You're going to foster more of it. And ignorance breeds what? It breeds disability. Disability in the form of entitlement.
That's true. All right, well, one more story very quickly. We have Twitter, which also has been in some hot water lately, but they just announced that they're hiring these I guess academics, professors who have anti-Trump sentiment, but they're researchers and they're set out to study the echo chambers of uncivil discourse. Now, Twitter said it did a vigorous review process, and it chose a group that's going to be led by Dutch professor Rebecca Trumbull to study, quote, how communities form around political discussions on Twitter and the challenges that may arise as those discussions develop. Now, Trumbull and at least 4 of the 6 researchers have on their Twitter accounts put anti-Trump sentiment. Some of the tweets include, the end is not near, it's here. Trump looks cruelty in the face and demands more of it. Times cover captures that well. Constant vigilance is still needed. And so Trumbull actually said, in the context of growing political polarization, the spread of misinformation and increases in incivility and intolerance, it's clear that if we're going to effectively evaluate and address some of the most difficult challenges arising on social media, academic researchers and tech companies will need to work together much more closely.
Yeah, in other words, we have a problem at Twitter. Twitter's problem is we're shadow banning conservatives, not liberals. The problem is that we're deactivating the accounts of conservatives, not liberal progressives. We are putting undue pressure on liberals, conservatives, and Republicans to justify their comments while allowing really, really radical comments on the left to thrive. Okay, that's what we're doing. How are we, progressive Twitter, how are we going to fix this? We're going to hire the most rabid group of progressive academics we can find who already hate conservatives, who already despise Republicans and Donald Trump. We're going to put them in charge of working with tech companies to make sure that there is no more future bias against liberals.
Absolutely. Well, that leads right into Dunce of the Day. We have some good candidates this week. We're going to kick it off with Anne Hathaway, who said on her Instagram that all black people, fear their lives daily in America. Basically what happened was that an 18-year-old black woman was killed in Oakland on Sunday, and so Anne Hathaway put up a picture on Instagram and put this long caption. It said, "Wilson's death is unspeakable and must not be met with silence. She was a black woman and she was murdered in cold blood by a white man. White people, including me, including you, must take into the marrow of our privileged bones the truth that all black people fear for their lives daily in America and have done so for generations. We must ask our white selves, how decent are we really? Not in our intent, but in our actions, in our lack of action." And to kick it off, she also said that Wilson is not a hashtag, because everyone uses hashtags. And then Hathaway proceeded to write the hashtags of Black Lives Matter, anti-racist, no excuse, say her name, and earn the right to say her name.
Yeah, and so she says that it's an unspeakable tragedy that must be spoken of, right? That's how she said? So Anne Hathaway, it's regrettable, right? An African American was murdered by a white person. And this then, of course, prompts a huge screed from you about the inherent racism of all of us. And I'm still waiting for your comment on the much more sizable number of African Americans who are murdered by other African Americans. Where is that hashtag, honey? Hashtag black people fear for their lives from other black people. Because if you're going to make the first statement, the second statement is statistically much more problematic, but you won't do it. Although, then again, you're the airhead who says that people aren't hashtags and then start hashtagging them. So, Anne Hathaway.
There she is, candidate number one. Let's go on to another crazy, Kathy Griffin, who just built a wall around her $10 million mansion to block her Trump-supporting neighbor. She says, "We kind of built like a little," as Trump would say, "we built a wall. I'm not a Trump supporter, but we built a wall." And while we don't know who the neighbor is, it's basically reported that she's been in a legal battle with one of her neighbors named Jeffrey Metzger for a year. And so the person who's anti-Trump does exactly
and anti-walls.
And anti-walls.
Yeah,
does
that's
exactly.
right. As long as Hollywood's communities stay gated, they will be firmly against a wall, right? If the feces and the syringes of downtown San Francisco made their way into uptown Burbank or Hollywood, you'd see a lot more walls. In fact, all the Hollywood communities have walls. Walls are for rich, important liberals. They're not for you and me. Here, I've said this before. If we could get to the point where we could give every illegal immigrant crossing the border a Donald Trump T-shirt and a little walking mug, a little travel thermos, right, to get through the desert environment. We gave everybody a little, MAGA, M-A-G-A thermos and a little red MAGA hat. I can tell you, and you could just show just one image of thousands of border crossers wearing Trump shirts. That wall would be built by Hollywood immediately, and Kathy Griffin would be troweling on the spackle or whatever the hell it is. She'd be troweling on the mortar, right, to build those walls, because we got to stop that. Enough said.
Well, that kind of leads into our next candidate of Nancy Pelosi, who is saying it's the Democrats who have been strong on border security. Speaking of that wall, at a press conference, she said, quote, "We have a responsibility to protect our borders. Let's make no mistake about that, and Democrats have been strong on that point." She said that migrant mothers seeking entry to the U.S. via Mexico had no other option, and that illegal immigration is the only recourse they have. In the past, we know that Pelosi has said that having a southern border wall is a sign of weakness that undermines who we are as a country.
And Nancy Pelosi lives in a $1 million mansion that is gated. Right, so here's the thing. Nancy Pelosi, I refuse to pick on her, because if you've watched her gaffes, if you've watched her cognitive malfunction, this is a sick woman. Mm-hmm. And the fact that the Democrat Party is comfortable having somebody who has lost the best aspects of their mental faculties shows you that not only are they not the party of of strong borders, and they are not the party of helping immigrants, because they don't do much to help immigrants when they're here anyway. This is also the party that ignores serious mental illness. It ignores what is clearly early onset dementia. It ignores the fact that the Speaker of your House is somebody who is so wildly dissociated and so linguistically challenged now that you keep cruelly letting her get in front of microphones and espouse your positions. It says a lot more about you Democrats than it does Nancy Pelosi.
All right, we are going to take a look at Christina Mittermeier, who is a photographer for National Geographic, and she just in the upcoming August edition of the National Geographic admits that her photo in the video that was produced by National Geographic, capturing what they're calling a dying polar bear. They said it was dying from climate change polar bear, that it was misleading. And this December 2017 video with this, you can see the starved-looking polar bear, it went viral, and it became the highest viewed video on National Geographic's website. And Mittermeier thinks that 2.5 billion people may have actually been impacted by this video. And she says that we may have gone too far. The mission was a success, but there was a problem. We had lost control of the narrative. The first line of the National Geographic video said, "This is what climate change looks like." With climate change, it was highlighted, and it made a very bold statement. In retrospect, National Geographic went too far with the caption.
You think so? We know that the attention span of generations now, the younger generations, is about 5 seconds. They'll read the first sentence, the first phrase, they'll watch the first maybe 5 seconds of a video. Your opening statement was, "This is what climate change looks like." And you knew, National Geographic, the vast majority of people weren't going to read the rest of the article where you backpedal from that. You're not arguing that that polar bear is dying because of climate change. You're arguing that this is what climate change might look like 100 years from now if things go as bad as our researchers say they might without evidence. So you set that up, and now she's upset that now she's recognized that people have misread what she had said. This is part of the overall plan. And so for me, as far as I'm concerned, people, again, aren't stupid. It was obvious when I saw that picture of the starving polar bear that this was nothing to do with climate change. It had everything to do with sickness.
All right, our final candidate this week is LeBron James, who he's been outspoken in the past, and he said some good things and done some good things. But now he is accusing Trump of using sports to divide us. He was on a CNN interview, and he says, when you're a part of sports, it just brings so much camaraderie and so much fun. We're in a position right now in America, more importantly, where this race thing has taken over because I believe our president is kind of trying to divide us. He says, I don't want to say kinda, he's dividing us. And what I've noticed over the last few months is that he's kind of used sports to kind of divide us. So we have our 5 candidates. Who are you picking this week?
I'm picking Anne Hathaway because what she did is so egregiously stupid, right? She took this is sociological invalid, right? She took one case of one shooting where a white person killed a black person and then blew that up into some radical case that white people everywhere are guilty all the time. So the enormity of her stupidity, I suppose, in that particular instance is why I give her the award.
I picked basically your argument, but for why Christina Mittermeier gets the award, because with this image, she even said that 2.5 billion people may have been impacted by this. The level and influence that she has based on that photo, and just like you said, the attention spans of us only reading one sentence and then being like, that's exactly what it was, climate change. The influence that she has makes her much more dangerous than Anne Hathaway's reach. And the reason I chose Christina is because she says, I'll do it again. But we'll end this segment with that. If you like what you just saw with Dr. Duke and myself, make sure you watch us again either on YouTube or Facebook, and make sure you head over to SoundCloud and iTunes to listen to the podcast versions. Up next, we have Charlie Kirk with some talking points.
Time now for Talking Points with Charlie Kirk, founder of Turning Point USA. Charlie, the news is ablaze with the love of democratic socialism. Can you explain to us, first of all, where this is coming from with outstanding economic performance, with low unemployment? People can't find enough employees for their work. Why is there this resurgence now in a left-wing fascination with socialism?
Well, look, it's very easy to be generous with other people's money. What I find to be most stunning about the people that are socialists, it's that they say they hate America, they say they hate the idea of America. What's so interesting about our country is that we're the only country in the history of the world where even those who hate it refuse to leave. They want to bring the very ideas that our grandparents fought and died against. Mind you, we fought and won the Cold War. We fought against communism all across the world. Now they want to bring those very ideas here to the homeland, which is it's so wrong. It is so morally misguided. Socialism is, as Winston Churchill said, it's the creed of the envy. It's the doctrine of the ignorant, something like that, where essentially it's about taking other people's things, about taking other ideas. It's about always growing government to benefit not benefit other people, but to benefit the elites. And mind you, if you look at Venezuela, which is a very good example, the left loved talking about Venezuela for years. Oh, Venezuela is a great example of democratic socialism. Venezuela's, they care about other people, all this nonsense. And now Venezuela is in flames. Inflation in Venezuela will hit 1,000,000% this year, 1,000,000%. And it's a misunderstanding of the incentive structure, misunderstanding of the price system, misunderstanding of economics in general. And this whole new conversation has really been brought to the forefront because of Ocasio-Cortez's win in New York. And I like to say the Republican Party is the party of Abraham Lincoln. The Democrat Party's become the party of Karl Marx. That is a fight that I'm willing to embrace. But it's kind of horrifying if they win.
Why do you think it's so prevalent that when socialism fails, you mentioned that people come to our country, oftentimes illegally from foreign countries, they're running away in places like Mexico, they're running away from socialist governments, and yet when they get here, at least initially they tend to vote for socialist policies. And it's even worse than that. You have native-born Americans, Californians, for instance, who are fleeing the tax burden and the social welfare system of California, moving to places like Texas and Idaho and Arizona, and then voting for socialist candidates in those states as well. Why is it so impossible for socialists, both people who grew up with socialism and people who fetishize it, to learn from their mistakes?
Well, look, the issue is that the elites that push socialism actually benefit tremendously from it. It's the very people that are suffering underneath it that are the ones that are the worst part of the equation. And so, look, it's very easy to sell socialism. Utopianism is a very attractive, sexy idea to a populace that is hurting and that is suffering. Where I'll agree with the socialists. They say, well, the system is rigged for the wealthy, the few, and the well-connected. Okay, well, I'll generally agree with that. But then why would we want to make the system bigger and stronger? Their solution is to make the very government that they believe is rigged against them to have more power, to have more jurisdiction, to have more bureaucrats, and to have more capacity to go after the little guy like us. The richest counties in America are all surrounding Washington, D.C. This is 8 out of 10 of the wealthiest counties in America are around Washington, D.C. To look at wealth, looking at a county structure is actually the best way to see how wealth concentrates. Geographically, when you have 80% of the wealthiest counties in America within a 50-mile radius of Washington, what does that tell you? It tells you that we have been rigging the game against the little guy by making government too big. Therefore, the logical answer in no way could possibly be to make that very same government bigger, more powerful, and have more control over our life.
You mentioned Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and we now know of her background that she was a very privileged young woman growing up. She was hardly Alexi from the block. We now know that for the second consecutive year, Bernie Sanders, socialist fanboy, he has made more than $1 million in personal earnings, let alone what his wife brings in. And we have Kathy Griffin, the big-mouth comedian, anti-Trump supporter of socialism, who just built a wall around her own property to protect her from her Republican neighbor. And so the idea here that the very wealthiest among us, the most privileged among us, they see socialism as a solution. It really is more about the idea that they're going to be in the elite that run this organization. They're going to be the oligarchy, right? They're going to be the small minority that gets to tell the rest of us what to do.
That's right. And you hit it so perfectly, is that what socialism does is it creates this small elite, and then the masses underneath have to live in total, absolute, permanent, and perpetual misery, while the elites say, oh, don't worry, utopianism is right around the corner. Oh, well, the reason we haven't achieved utopianism is because of racism and xenophobia and sexism. You see this in California, where they're continually blaming conservatives and capitalists. There's none left. Like, you have nothing left to blame. Like, you control everything in California, from the supermajority in the state legislature to the governor, the attorney general, to the U.S. senators, to the congressmen. They control everything in California. You have nothing left to blame, except California has become a total wasteland and hellhole. You see it in Venezuela. But it's also the soft implementation of socialism that people have to resist, whether it be France, whether it be Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece. These are countries that we should reject wholeheartedly, with income tax rates upward of 70 to 80%, with a work ethic that is completely and totally deteriorated, with the death of nationalism, the death of national identity, which is a very, very scary thing happening in Europe. And so I reject all forms of socialism. But people say, and if you give me a minute, I want to touch on this. People say, oh, well, what about the Nordic countries? What about Sweden and Norway and Finland and Denmark? Well, my definition of socialism, first and foremost, is how much economic freedom do you allow? Well, by the World Economic Freedom Index, by every metric, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland have a higher ranking on the World Economic Freedom Index than the United States of America. So for that, I applaud them. Less regulation, lower taxes, that's great. Where do they go wrong? Well, they have very high personal income taxes on the wealthy. That's not good. 70% confiscatory tax, not even close to being good. But here's the other thing. They only have a population of 8 million people that is very homogenous, low rates of immigration. They're changing that for the worse. But they also don't have to pay for a military. The United States of America pays for the military of the entire European continent. We subsidize European socialism through our benevolent, and I would say kind of reckless, not reckless, but mistaken national security, where we build bases all across Europe, and we are able to subsidize European socialism.
I think one of the most remarkable examples of this we have in the world today is Barack Obama, the socialist community activist or organizer, right, who now is collecting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars in speaking fees in the economically devastated continent of Africa. He goes to Africa without any shame, talking to nations and people who have been ruined by quasi-dictatorial socialist regimes, raking all kinds of money that could go to feed tens of thousands of people for one single speech, and lecturing the West about its policies with regards to freedom and the greater good of all. It is really staggering when you think about how popular a figure someone like Barack Obama is, and he is building his mansion in Chicago has a wall on it to keep keep people out. Yep,
and armed guards.
That's right. And the library he's thinking of building, the presidential library he's trying to push on the people of Chicago, is going to be so expensive. It's going to use eminent domain to kick wealthy landowners off of their land so he can create this palace to himself. Local liberals in Chicago are even protesting this, and yet the Obama machine rolls along. Here's a question for you. Do you think the average American citizen, given how badly educated the public schools are training kids, our kids know nothing about economics, do you think the average American understands enough about the economy to recognize the difference between free markets and socialism?
They don't, and this is why I love the work that you're doing, to actually educate people on the fundamentals and the basics, and you totally get it. You get the importance of it, you get the depth, you have the knowledge of the history. And look, it's not that young people are not being taught history. They're being taught the wrong history, which is even worse when you think about it. I mean, they're being taught that America was founded on racism and homophobia and xenophobia and colonialism. This is all nonsense. They're being taught that somehow the Republican and Democrat Party switched in the 1960s. There's zero evidence to suggest that whatsoever. In fact, Democrats have always been about controlling people. They just control them differently today than they did back in the 1960s or in the 1920s. And so, look, here's the bottom line, is that the work you're doing is so important because we need to educate the American populace on the fundamentals of civics, the Constitution, history, economics, because once people have that basic line of information, then they can make the most informed decision. But only someone who doesn't understand history could possibly be a Marxist, and that's why you're seeing the rise of socialism in America.
Yeah, we see that with our school, FreedomProject Academy. We start introducing sound economic ideas to kids as young as elementary school because we recognize as they get older, they begin to see how economics and history go hand in hand, which is something the public schools don't teach.
That's exactly right. And so, look, if you understand economics, you have to understand history. If you understand history, you have to understand economics. Like, why did the Great Depression happen? Well, it didn't happen because of, rich, wealthy people that were over-speculating. It happened because of central bank policy and the Smoot-Hawley tariff and stuff like that people don't really, they don't teach in our schools. They say, oh, it's always the capitalist's fault. Well, that's not true. So it's so important, the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you. And before I let you go, I got to ask you, in the news today, Bernie Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez promoting a Medicare for All program that would cost $32.6 trillion over the next 10 years. $1 trillion.
It's unbelievable. I mean, so look, at least there's a price tag on it. And Bernie Sanders actually bragging about it. He's like, oh, it's not that much money. What are you kidding me? I mean, so look, but no matter what the government touches, it ruins. No matter what, the left destroys everything it touches. Never forget that. And if you think healthcare is horrible now and you think it's expensive now, just wait until it's free and wait until government is mandating it. And so look, we need to get to free market economics in healthcare, free market principles, which would bring down cost of healthcare, bring up the quality, and expand the accessibility. Bernie Sanders wants to bring another social welfare program that would further bankrupt this country and worsen the quality of healthcare. We need to resist it at every turn.
Yeah, and I want to point out to the viewers that notice what the progressive left is doing. They're not proposing single-payer health care because most Americans associate that with socialism. So what are they arguing? Let's take an existing entitlement, Medicare, which probably should never have been approved anyway. Let's take an existing entitlement, Medicare, and turn it into single-payer socialist nationalist health care without really telling people that's what we're doing.
That's right. That's exactly right. And so Medicare is bankrupt. It's ripe with fraud. It's actually a bad deal for a lot of people, but that's besides the point. But they're just trying to further expand it, and they're good at branding, to give them give them credit for that. But we have to resist that and reject it.
Seems like we're beginning to see some Democrats beginning to push back a little bit against Cortez and that particularly viral sort of socialism, the populist socialism. Do you think more of that will happen before the elections in 2018?
I sure hope so. But at the same time, the Democrats have always been some blend of pseudo-Marxism and socialism. Now they're just fully embracing it. Politically, we have a great opportunity now to say, see, we told you, this is the party of Marx. And so, look, I'm very upset. I'm not upset. I'm very worried that the more power that they get, the more harm they're going to do to this country. That's why it's incumbent on us to defeat them at the ballot box this November.
Charlie, great talking to you. We will see you again next week.
You too. Thanks so much.